My mom says she never hated me, but she helped bury the one piece of evidence that nearly ruined my life. She swears it wasn't her idea. So whose was it? I bought my dad a luxury SUV for his retirement. I put a red bow on it, had it delivered to the restaurant 3 months after I ordered it, and told the valet to hold it until dessert. I wanted it to be a moment, not some gaudy apology or an attempt to buy affection, but a loud, quiet way of saying, look, I did the thing. After 35 years in real estate, he was finally stepping down. I thought this might be the moment he'd see me. He'd always been magnetic, the kind of man who could fill a room with laugh lines and compliments and make strangers feel like the most important person in the world. But there was a flip side to that charm, a cruel little switch he could flick if you crossed some invisible line. Up close, the charm didn't belong to me. I learned early that I wasn't one of the people he reserved it for. I could get a promotion, buy a house, even fix his rusted mower on a Saturday, and it was nothing. Megan, younger, quieter, never trying very hard, could text him back and suddenly she was the golden kid. I grew up thinking I just hadn't earned it yet. So on that night, surrounded by family and his old coworkers, I gave him the car. The dinner hummed with small talk and toasts, the clink of forks and the warm, oily light of a restaurant that smelled faintly of garlic and celebration. I went up last, cleared my throat, and said a few honest words about his work ethic, about what his career had meant to the family, about hoping he'd enjoy his retirement. I remember the taste of the wine, the way the room seemed to lean in. He stood, glass raised, looked straight at me, and said, loud enough for everyone, let's drink to my stupid son who thinks that by buying me a car, I'll finally respect him. That's funny. Then he sat down like he'd told the funniest joke of the night. Silence fell like a curtain. Megan didn't even lift her eyes. Mom's hand trembled around her stemmed glass. One of his old colleagues gave me a half smile that was halfway between pity and embarrassment. The noise in my ears was the kind that makes you aware of your heartbeat. I didn't argue. I didn't scream or cry. I stood up, left my plate, and walked out. Outside, the evening air smelled cool and a little like wet pavement. I called a tow company from the parking lot, paid for the valet to walk away without questions, and had the SUV taken back to my place. When I pulled into my driveway that night and saw it sitting there, ribbon gone, headlights catching on the chrome, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, clarity. Not rage, not shame, just a clean, sharp understanding of the kind of man my father had always been. Morning came with 20 missed calls. Voicemails. A string of texts that started short and then grew long, frantic. I ignored them. I made coffee. I stood in the sun by the SUV, running my fingers along the wheel like it was a relic of a life I'd tried to buy into. Then Megan walked in like the house belonged to her, no knock, just the soft click of the door and the look on her face. Pale. Serious. She handed me her phone without a word. A family group chat. Dad's picture of my SUV in my driveway. The messages were a thing of theater. Brian just proved he doesn't respect family. That car was a gift. Lucky for him I didn't call the cops. Another, we need to talk or things will get ugly. And then the twist, he'd followed the tow truck home. He'd been parked outside the restaurant waiting. He'd driven past my house all night. At first I laughed because it felt too absurd. But Megan didn't laugh. She told me what he'd been whispering to people, that I was unstable, that I'd tried to humiliate him, that I was somehow out to ruin him. The message was clear, if the SUV was gone, make the son the problem. That was just the opening volley. He started calling landlords, my office, a friend at the permit office. He told people I was cooking the books, doing shady deals through my business. A voicemail from my office manager came through, someone claiming to be from the IRS had phoned asking about my records, and they seemed to know details they shouldn't. My stomach dropped. This wasn't about a car anymore. It was about control. But I wasn't helpless. I'd been saving things for years, not because I wanted a fight, but because keeping a record of the weirdness helped me remember I wasn't crazy. Emails, screenshots, voicemails, an old message where he bragged about writing off fake expenses back when he was still in the business. I called Sasha, an old college friend who runs a forensic accounting shop. I sent her my binder. 15 minutes later she was on the line calling it prison chaos and promising to carve out a summary that would make him sweat. I wanted that little pressure, the slow tightening of the screws, not a headline pile-on. Let the dominoes start falling. 3 days later, I found out he'd been operating behind the curtain with help. I discovered my own deed tucked away in a folder I'd labeled back burner, a small parcel of land I'd quietly bought years ago, a sliver of my grandfather's property my dad had sold when he needed cash. He'd always spoken about that land like it was his unfulfilled dream. He planned cabins and legacies on it the way other people plan vacations. He didn't know I had it. So I used it the way you use the one clean hand you've been dealt. I called the county about surveys and public easements. I ordered a 40-foot steel shipping container and scheduled it to be dropped right on the curve of the road that passed his old vacation property, in a way that didn't technically block anything but made the myth he'd built about himself impossible to ignore. I bolted that bright orange behemoth to concrete pads. A note on the side read, "Private property, trespassers will be prosecuted." I wanted the container to be a statement, not just an obstruction. I wanted his tidy little legend about, one day, to run headfirst into the fact that the land no longer belonged to him. He reacted exactly as I'd expected, fury, theatrics, a sheriff's deputy consulting a map and saying, "No, sir. That property is in your son's name." He raged. He threatened. He tried to bully the deputy. I was there watching from across the field, boots in the dirt, feeling the container settle under my hands. I wanted to feel the thunk of it hitting the ground because I wanted the physical confirmation that I wasn't shrinking away anymore. Then came the letter. Megan had gone to confront Mom about the group chat and came back with something worse than denial. Hidden in a closet, among old tax records, she'd found a folded, yellowed letter Dad had written years ago. The first line burned through the page like acid: "I never wanted a son." There it was. Not an offhand cruelty, not a harsh line said in the heat of things, a deliberate sentence that opened a door I didn't even know existed. Sentences after it were worse, boys try to replace. Girls stay grateful. He spelled out, in his own voice, that I was never part of the design he'd imagined. I sat down with that letter in my hands and for the first time I felt something shift. Whatever moral high ground he thought he had dissolved into ink and paper. The files in my bridge folder told the rest of the story: fake customer lists, audio where he contradicted himself, forwarded business records from Mom, the small, steady acts of a man who'd spent decades shaping a narrative. I scanned the letter, added it to my packet, and then quietly sent that packet to family, to his old work contacts, to the state board. No commentary. Just documents, the evidence laid out like a mirror with no charm to soften the reflection. Predictably, the backlash started. Dad left the group chat and blocked my number. Aunt Lorraine called furious. Jared texted. But it wasn't just chatter this time. Mark, the partner he'd written out years ago, showed up with notarized complaints, witness statements, and old financial records. He filed with the state board the way a man with a grudge and receipts files things, thoroughly. The audit notice landed at Dad's address 2 weeks later. Megan broke from Mom. She moved into her own apartment, started therapy, and slowly put distance between the family drama and her life. I donated the SUV to charity. I didn't do it for petty revenge, I did it because I didn't want the car to be a monument to an effort to buy something money could never purchase. I didn't broadcast any of it to the world. I didn't drag him on TV or scream his name from rooftops. The slow erosion, the audit, the complaints, the people in his circle finally reading those documents and remembering things, did the damage quietly and efficiently. When a man's life is built on a performance, pull the stage away and the performance collapses without a fight. So that's where this chapter closed for me, with the county records filed, the orange container bolted into place, the packet of evidence out where people could see it, and a silence from the man who used to drown rooms with his voice. I stood by that container one morning, hands on the cold steel, and felt something settle in my chest that wasn't forgiveness. It was freedom. But even as the last of the calls faded and the dust started to settle, there was a small, sharp thought that wouldn't leave me: destroying a legacy isn't the same as rebuilding a life. What happens when the dominoes stop falling, and someone else who's been waiting for the stage to go dark decides to step into the light? I kept moving forward the way people do when the path is suddenly lit by something ugly. You hurry, not because you want to, but because the light makes the shadows look like threats. After the packet went out and the audit notice landed at his door, the immediate pressure shifted from theatrics to paperwork. That part was boring and brilliant at the same time: signatures, notarized statements, permits, and a slow, grinding legal machinery that eats arrogance for breakfast. I spent days at the container, pacing the gravel, talking to the neighbors, answering questions from reporters who smelled scandal the way dogs smell rain. I tried to be measured when I spoke, factual, calm, almost boring, because facts are the dull knives that cut the loudest lies. People came by to see the orange box, to take pictures, to ask why I chose steel and concrete over some polite gesture. I told them I wanted a place for quiet, for a different kind of legacy, a garden, a fenced-off patch with a plaque that read something simple and human, something like, "For the steady and the small." The words changed a few times before I settled on anything. It's hard to be poetic when there's paperwork to be filed. Mark checked in every few days. He'd been a bruiser in business, the kind of man who keeps receipts like a second brain. Watching him hand over the notarized forms and witness statements felt like watching a slow, inevitable reckoning. Sasha kept sending me updates in terse emails: "We've got the shell entities traced. We can rebut anything they try to throw at you." She flagged the parts to save for the board, the parts to send to the county, the parts to keep for a lawyer if things turned theatrical. She had that tone like she was packing a suitcase for a trip she knew was coming, efficient, a little thrill in the planning. Megan started to breathe easier. Her voice on the phone had lost that tight, scared edge. One night she came over with ramen in tiny plastic bowls and told me about the first time she'd laughed since everything started. It felt normal to hear her laugh again, a small, genuine sound that made the apartment feel less like a bunker and more like a living room. She told me she'd filed for her own records and was sorting through the emotional debris of our family. Therapy was working. So were small bills paid for with money she earned. That sort of dignity is slow, but it sticks. For a while, things settled into a new rhythm. The county accepted our permit application for the memorial garden after a minor public comment period. People showed up to the meeting and spoke in favor: old neighbors who remembered my grandfather's house, folks who liked the idea of a peaceful spot instead of another gated eyesore. I watched the permits get stamped and felt a genuine, physical lightness the day the final paper was signed. I was building more than a garden, I was building a future that didn't need his approval to exist. Of course, he didn't fold quietly. Men like him rarely do. He shifted strategies. If charm and rumor couldn't unmake me, then perhaps paperwork could: a complaint here, a zoning quibble there, a whisper campaign to anyone who would listen. One afternoon my business inbox started repeating itself with small, identical emails: "We are investigating irregularities in your filings." Different senders, same language. Sasha said those are classic napalm moves: light a lot of tiny fires and hope something flares. Then, late one rainy Thursday, the next volley landed in a way that felt personal and surgical. An envelope arrived with official-looking creases. I recognized the county's watermark on the front. My hands felt a little too steady as I slid it open. Inside was a subpoena, a real one, not the social media kind. It listed hearing dates and document requests and, like a kind of cruel punctuation, a witness list. My name was on it, of course. So were my company's records. What made the air go thin in my lungs was the last line, witness, Margaret Ellis, testimony regarding recollections of Mr. Ellis's financial practices and anecdotal evidence of family financial arrangements. Margaret was Mom's legal name. She was also the woman who had forwarded my old business post office box information into a group chat like it was nothing, like forwarding a weather report. She'd laughed about it to Megan in a kitchen I'd once thought of as neutral ground. Seeing her name on that subpoena felt like someone taking a scalpel to a scar and reminding you it's there. I sat down hard at the kitchen table. Rain hammered the windows as if to drown out the noise in my head. A dozen things ricocheted through me at once: betrayal, the logic that Mom had been more involved than I'd admitted to myself, the possibility that she'd testify and make a tidy, homegrown case that would be levered against me in a public hearing. If she spoke, what would she say? Would she stand by the truth, or would she shape it to save whatever remained of the family look she'd cared about her whole life? I thought of the letter, that merciless first line we'd found. I thought of the way she'd passed it over like a discreet handoff, like she'd been protecting someone from an inconvenient truth for decades. Was she going to stand in front of the board and speak for him? Had she ever really been on my side, or was her peacekeeping simply another performance? The phone buzzed on the table. It was Mark. "You get one of those?" he asked, voice low with that odd mix of triumph and worry. "Yep," I said. "Margaret's on it." There was a pause, a small inhalation through the line. "That's delicate," he said. "You sure you want to push forward if she's going to testify for him?" The question sat heavy. I'd wanted a reckoning, not a war of attrition. I had wanted the lies lifted, and yet now the collateral was not just a man whose charm had costs, but a mother who'd carried her own quiet compromises. I knew what I had to do, but knowing and doing are different things. I could call her, plead, beg, accuse, or I could prepare. I opened my laptop and started the list: witnesses to call, documents to pull, emails to highlight. Sasha would want a week, Mark wanted to volunteer as an extra witness, Megan wanted to show up and sit in the front row with a notebook. Then the doorbell rang. No one visits unannounced at that hour, not unless they want something immediate, and the rain had thinned to a mist that made the world smell like iron. I didn't move for a second. My pulse kept time with the drip from the eaves. The bell rang again, insistent, like someone who knew I was home and wanted to remind me I wasn't safe even in the small piece I'd carved out. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked to the door. Through the frosted glass I could see a shape, tall, heavy-shouldered, someone who didn't hesitate at thresholds. When I opened it, the person standing there wasn't a neighbor, not a reporter, not a cop. It was my mother. Her hair was pinned the same way she'd worn it at every holiday, but her eyes were different, clear, focused, and for the first time in my memory, not trying to smooth anything over. She didn't smile. She looked at me like someone who had rehearsed a speech and thrown it away. "I need to talk," she said. Her voice was small but steady. "It's time you knew everything." Her words dropped heavier than the rain still dripping from her coat. "It's time you knew everything." For a second, I couldn't move. My mother had been the constant background noise of my life, quiet, soft, always stepping in to smooth Dad's rough edges, to hush arguments before they turned into storms. But now, standing on my porch, she wasn't smoothing anything. She looked like someone carrying a box of secrets that had gotten too heavy to hold. I stepped aside. "Come in." She walked past me, her heels clicking against the hardwood. She didn't bother with pleasantries, didn't ask about the house, didn't even look at the SUV still sitting in the driveway. She went straight to the kitchen table and sat down, folding her hands tightly like she was keeping them from shaking. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The clock ticked. The fridge hummed. My chest felt tight, like I was bracing for a car crash I couldn't stop. "Finally," she said, "he wasn't supposed to send me that subpoena. That was a mistake." Her lips pressed thin, almost bitter. "He thinks I'll cover for him like I always have. He doesn't realize. I don't want to anymore." I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "So what? You're switching sides now." The words came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't take them back. Her eyes flicked up, meeting mine. "Brian, you think I stayed quiet because I didn't care. That's not true. I stayed quiet because your father, he's not just cruel. He's dangerous." Dangerous. I almost laughed, but the way she said it made the room colder. "You think you know him?" she continued. "You've seen his temper, his need to control, the way he twists everything. But you don't know the deals he made, the things he buried. I thought if I kept the peace, if I kept you safe, you'd get through it without being destroyed. But now," she stopped, staring at her hands. "Now he's making you his target. I can't let that happen." Her voice cracked on the last word. I sat down across from her. "So tell me, what's in this everything you think I need to know?" She hesitated, scanning my face like she was weighing whether I was ready for it. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a thick, worn envelope. She slid it across the table. "I've kept this for years. Longer than I should have. It's not just his letters. It's contracts, receipts, evidence. Things I copied when he wasn't looking. He would have destroyed me if he found out." I stared at the envelope like it was radioactive. My fingers itched to open it, but my gut told me once I did, there'd be no going back. "What's in here?" I asked quietly. Her voice dropped low. "Proof. That he's been laundering money since before you were even born. That some of the people he called friends weren't just business partners, they were cover. And that if he goes down, he'll try to drag you with him." The room tilted. My stomach knotted so hard I had to press a hand against it. She went on. That's why he's been so desperate to smear you. If you look like the unstable one, if you look like the fraud, then when his house of cards collapses, he can point at you and say that's where it came from. Silence pressed in. My pulse roared in my ears. So what do you want from me? I finally asked. Her eyes glistened, but her jaw stayed set. I want you to survive this. I want you to use what's in that envelope. And I want you to understand something. What? Her lips trembled, but she forced the words out anyway. Your father never wanted a son. But I did. For a second, I couldn't breathe. All the years of her silence, her neutrality, the way she stood in the background, it all slammed against that one sentence. Before I could respond, before I could even process, she added, but wanting you didn't mean I was brave enough to protect you. I'm sorry, Brian. The apology sat between us, jagged and raw. I reached for the envelope, sliding it closer. It was heavier than I expected. Inside was the weight of years, of secrets, of battles fought in shadows. As I tore it open and the first yellowed page slipped free, I realized something terrifying and liberating at the same time. This wasn't just about my father anymore. It was about the whole foundation of my family. And it was about to crack wide open. Because the envelope didn't just hold proof of his crimes. It held proof of who he really was. And the first page alone made me realize, this war was about to get a lot darker than I ever imagined. For a second there was a dizzying, sick little rush, like standing on a rooftop and realizing the railings not bolted. For a moment, his plan actually worked. The letter cut me in a place I didn't even know could be cut. It changed the shape of every memory I'd had of him. It made the past feel edited, like someone had slipped new paragraphs into an old book and handed it to me like truth. Then the fog cleared. I don't know if it was anger or relief that came first. Maybe both. I remember the way my hands trembled as I set the scan of Mom's letter down on the kitchen table, the paper's soft edges suddenly feeling like armor. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator and the little buzz of a distant lawnmower, ordinary noises that somehow made the whole thing feel unreal. I called Megan. Her voice on the line was small and careful at first, then hard and clipped the way it gets when someone's been pushed too many times. He planted it, she said, as if she were reading from a script somebody else had written for a cruel play. He wrote a phony letter, dated it, tucked it away where someone would find it later. He rehearsed the discovery. I sat down. I could feel my knees under the table like they were the last two supports holding the room up. Why would he do that? I asked. It sounded naive even as the question left my mouth. Because he's brilliant at narratives. Megan answered. He writes his stories, then he writes the evidence to back them up. He makes the truth bend to him. I thought back to the way he'd smiled that night in the restaurant, the casual cruelty of that toast, and suddenly nothing about it felt improvised. It had all been theater, every laugh, every silence, perfectly timed. I emailed Mom's letter to my lawyer and texted Sasha at the accounting shop as well. Then I called Aunt Lorraine because she'd been the first person Megan mentioned when the whole fake letter idea came up. She picked up on the second ring, her voice a little too chipper, the kind of chipper that hides static. I told her to be blunt. It wasn't that direct, she said after I laid it out. He joked about it once at a family barbecue. Said something like, if ever things go sideways, I'll be ready with a note that'll settle anything. I thought he was being dramatic. Guess he was serious. I remember the slow hollow feeling when the last piece slid into place. He'd thought of this for years. He hadn't just reacted, he'd planned. He'd anticipated the blowback, designed a weaponized paperwork trap, and set it where it would do the most damage. I forwarded Aunt Lorraine's message to my lawyer. She called me back within the hour. This is a gift, she said, and not in the cheerful way gifts are usually described. Admissions like that? People who brag about seeding fake documents, that's ammunition. It undercuts his credibility so hard he can hardly stand up in front of a judge. So we turned the fake letter story into paperwork, cold, boring, perfect paperwork. We had the letter examined, paper fiber, ink age, photocopy artifacts. Small things, forensic details you don't notice unless you're looking for them. Sasha dug through email headers and server logs. Mark pulled from his old boxes, receipts and timestamped notes from the years my dad had been building the narrative about me. Each tiny fact felt like another brick removed from the wall he'd been behind for decades. Still, the psychological damage had been done. People, even the ones who wanted to believe me, paused when they thought about that first line, I never wanted a son. It reverberated. It made conversations awkward. Mothers I'd known for years lowered their voices. A few clients sent texts that took 2 or 3 tries to say, are you okay, and then signed off with heart emojis and nothing else. It was like walking through a neighborhood after a tornado, everything standing, but every house with a new, unspoken scar. There were practical moves, too. We filed a response to the cease and desist. We compiled affidavits from people who could vouch for my character, for the timeline of when documents were found and who had seen them. We lodged a request to preserve any evidence of how that old letter had been handled. My lawyer drafted a quiet, surgical reply that said, we will not pull the distributed materials. If you pursue court, we will produce everything, including, if necessary, the provenance that proves the letter is a plant. But the legal chess was only part of it. The family dynamic was a live wire. Megan stopped returning Mom's texts. She'd pared down contact to a cold, functional line, logistics, nothing more. I tried calling Mom once, half pleading, half accusing, and she didn't pick up. When she finally answered, her voice was small and raw. I thought I was protecting you, she said. I thought I was keeping the peace. She sounded like someone discovering she had been a character in a story written by another person. Protecting me by handing over my business addresses? I asked. The words were calm, but they landed like a slap anyway. You know what that looks like when he winds it up. There were pauses long enough that I could hear her breathing. I'm sorry, she said finally. I didn't write that first letter. I didn't realize he had made it. I thought I could keep it from getting worse. I wanted to be satisfied, to feel that solidarly triumph of exposing the plot and watching the puppeteer trip on his strings. Instead I felt exhausted. Exposing the lie didn't magically heal the years she'd bowed her head. It just made the fractures visible. A week later we got something unexpected, an anonymous envelope slipped under my front gate. No stamp, no return address, heavy as if it were full of paper. My heart did that staccato thing again when I saw it sitting on the porch under the morning fog. Inside were photocopies of receipts and a short note written in block print. He's been paying people to testify. Check the timestamp on the permit office logs. Someone got $20,000 for silence last year. Not on your side. It felt like being watched. Someone was trying to play both ends, feeding me breadcrumbs while keeping their face in the dark. Was it a friend worried about me? A guilt-ridden accomplice? Or was it another plant, the kind that orbits these dramas and leaves chaos in its wake? I handed everything to Sasha. She smiled that thin smile that means, we've seen worse. We'll trace it, she said. There's always a trail. People forget that even when they think they're invisible, technology remembers. Meanwhile, Dad kept his distance publicly. No more taunts at dinner, no more toasts in rooms full of relatives. His silence was loud in its own way, a retreat that felt strategic. But at night there were small things. I'd get a neighbor's text that he'd been seen at the country club whispering with an ex-partner. Someone else told me a man had been asking questions about my accountant. The pressure device had been switched from bluster to stealth. One night I sat on the stoop outside the container with a flask of coffee and watched headlights slide past on the county road. The orange steel box looked absurd in the moonlight, like a piece of modern art nobody had asked for. Megan leaned back against the cool metal beside me. You okay? She asked. I'm better than last month, I lied. But she wasn't fooled. You won't have to fight him forever, she said. You just have to keep him from winning the small battles. And he'll make it personal because that's the only arena he thinks he can control. What if it gets worse? I asked. The truth, I had no idea. Part of me wanted the fight to be over already. Another part was waking up to the realization that this would be a long, ugly season. She shrugged, chewing the corner of a napkin. Then we make it worse for him. We make it more expensive. We make it obvious. Then she smiled, a small, fierce thing. Also, donate less of your cars to his old buddies. Charity's great, but apparently he has a soft spot for dramatics. A week later, my lawyer called with good news framed like a minor miracle. Handwriting analysis suggested the ink and paper in the old letter didn't match the era it claimed to be from. Computer logs showed an email forwarding chain that placed Mom's discovery in a context that suggested manipulation. We had dates, metadata, and witnesses who would swear under oath that the letter had been shown to people only after Dad had talked about having a plan in private chats. I wanted to breathe for the first time in weeks. But then the calendar notification popped up on my phone, hearing, State Board, 9 o'clock, Margaret Ellis, witness. My hand hovered over the screen. Margaret. Mom. The room swam. I turned the calendar off and on again like that would change the date. It didn't. The day of the hearing I woke up early, the kind of early that has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with something like dread. Megan arrived with a thermos and a legal pad. She'd folded the pad in half like armor. We'll be fine, she said, voice gentle but iron underneath. We're not just bringing our case. We're bringing receipts. We drove in a car that smelled faintly of coffee and peppermint gum. The courthouse had that institutional chill, the kind of place designed to remind people that the truth is a bureaucratic thing as much as a moral one. I kept my hands folded in my lap and watched the people come and go, lawyers with purposeful strides, witnesses with rigid shoulders, men who looked like they'd been fighting legal fights for decades and would keep itching at the same scab for the rest of their lives. Margaret arrived late and sat in the back, a small figure with a scarf tied around her throat. When she saw me she did something I didn't expect. She lifted a hand in a tiny, awkward wave. It was the kind of gesture that means I'm here and I'm sorry at the same time. Then the clerk called our case, and the room that had felt so large and solemn became a theater where every sound was amplified. She took the oath. Her voice trembled at first, then settled into a cadence that sounded practiced. The first questions were procedural, harmless. My lawyer asked the big ones later. When did she first see the letter? Who showed her where it was kept? Did she receive any compensation or instruction to speak? The answer that made my stomach drop was not a categorical yes or no. It was the tiny, chilling thing she said about memory. I remember pieces, she testified. He talked about a contingency plan. He joked about proof he could use someday. He might have written words like that and tucked them away. I don't remember writing it. That was the problem with small conspiracies. People remember feelings and fragments better than facts. When memory gets fuzzy, truth gets stitched with thread. Dad had always used charm and suggestion. We were doing okay. The state board members were asking sharp, boring questions, the kind that slice through melodrama. Sasha's forensic files were presented. Mark testified. We had timelines. We had metadata. We had the anonymous envelope's breadcrumbs traced back to an IP that, surprise, clicked from a cafe near one of Dad's old partner's houses. The dots were connecting. And then, just as we began to think the board might lean our way, the last witness they called walked in. He was new to our story, a man I'd never met, hair gray at the temples, shoulders like a man who carried himself carefully. He sat and signed his name with a hand that didn't tremble. I watched him look up and the room seemed to tilt. He cleared his throat and said, plainly, my name is Daniel Price. I handled public relations for Mr. Richardson for over a decade. Silence is a strange weight in a room full of words. Everyone turned. My mind ran a frantic loop. Who is he? Friend? Hired gun? I'd never heard of him. Megan whispered, this could go either way, and I realized she meant it. Daniel folded his hands and smiled, a small, businesslike smile. I'm here to clarify one thing, he said. We advised Mr. Richardson in many matters. We did not, to my knowledge, plant fraudulently dated letters in homes. But I can testify to one practice: when reputations are threatened, narratives are managed. Sometimes aggressively. Sometimes crossing lines. My breath stuck. He paused and then, in that even voice, added, and I have emails that show Mr. Richardson authorized certain strategic communications in times of crisis. I can turn those over if the board requires. The air in the hearing room shifted like a gust through a curtain. Faces changed. My lawyer sat up straighter. Margaret's hand covered her mouth. My mother's face, in the back, went ashen. I felt something open and then close inside me like a trapdoor. Daniel's presence was not a harmless cameo, it was a hinge. He was not a neutral witness. He was the kind of person whose emails and memos could place intention where once there was only rumor. When the hearing adjourned for recess, people gathered in small knots, whispering like gulls over a fish. I stayed put in my chair, palms flat against my knees. Megan leaned in and squeezed my hand. Whatever happens, she said, we did this. We had exposed the fake letter. We had traced breadcrumbs and put facts into a timeline. But the moment Daniel Price, with the smell of conference rooms and polite contracts about him, walked in, I realized how far this war had been fought off stage. We had lit a fire, and now the men who set the pyres were coming to see what the flames would do. Outside the courthouse I breathed, as if the whole morning were one long held breath released. The sun felt too bright after fluorescent court light. People moved in slow procession. Phones buzzed. Dad's name was on people's lips, but it wasn't the same tone as before. It was not the casual, admiring murmur. It was the curious, cautious whisper of people watching a story unfold. We walked back to the car and for the first time in months I felt something like exhausted relief. The real fight, the part I'd worried would destroy me, had a shape now. It had room numbers and dates and witnesses. It could be litigated, measured, contained. But as we rounded the courthouse steps, my phone buzzed. A single new message, terse and electronic. You opened a door you can't close. He's not done. DP. My throat went dry. Daniel Price's initials stared back at me on the screen like a dark signature. Looks like he's just moved to Act 2, Megan said softly, but I could hear the steel under the softness. Act 2. Stage directions. The script that had always been written by someone else was still being penned, and now the pen had been picked up by players with more resources than I'd counted on. I looked at the horizon where the road cut through the county fields and saw, for a moment, only orange, the container, stubborn and ridiculous, a billboard that said, this was mine. Then I tilted my head and thought of how many more doors he could open, how many more witnesses might come forward, and whether the truth, even when stacked with paperwork and metadata, would be loud enough to drown out a man who'd spent his life convincing people to look the other way. You ready? Megan asked. I let out a breath that tasted like metal and old coffee. No, I said, honest. But I don't have a choice. She nodded like that was all the answer she needed. We climbed into the car and drove down the road, past the container and past the house that had been a theater for my childhood. The engine was steady. The radio was off. We both knew the next scene would demand everything we had left.